They laughed at the old man carrying coffee, until a billionaire walked into the room and called him teacher. In the heart of downtown Chicago, rain hammered relentlessly against the glass windows of a luxury office tower. Richard Walker, 48, quietly knelt down to pick up the papers that had just been thrown straight at him. The entire office fell silent. No one dared to say a word. Brandon Cole, the company's young new boss, only 25 years old, crossed his arms and smirked. "You're outdated, Richard. Maybe it's time to retire before you embarrass yourself any further." Richard said nothing. Every night he drove his old Ford back to the house he was still struggling to pay off. His daughter's college tuition bill sat on the passenger seat. In his jacket pocket was his wife's unpaid hospital bill. He had grown used to swallowing every humiliation in silence. Until that day. The elevator doors opened. A young billionaire stepped into the conference room, then suddenly froze when he saw Richard. "Wait, Richard Walker works here?" The entire company exchanged confused glances. The powerful man immediately straightened his tie, then bowed his head to Richard. "Sir, I've been searching for you for years." At just 25 years old, Brandon Cole already carried himself like he owned the entire financial tech company in downtown Chicago. Armed with an MBA from a prestigious university, a polished way of speaking, designer suits, and a gleaming Rolex on his wrist, Brandon was the perfect image of young corporate America. Ambitious, confident, and painfully arrogant. Everyone in the company knew Brandon hadn't climbed into management purely on talent. His father was a longtime friend of one of the board members. But Brandon never acknowledged that. He preferred to see himself as the face of the new generation, young, fast, sharp, and ready to eliminate anyone who couldn't keep up with the pace of the modern world. And Brandon's favorite target was Richard Walker. Richard had worked at the company for nearly 20 years. He wasn't good at flattering people. He never bragged about his accomplishments. Every morning, he quietly arrived at the office at 7 a.m., worked steadily until late at night, and slipped out without drawing attention to himself. But to Brandon, that quiet professionalism looked like a symbol of being outdated. During a Monday morning meeting, Brandon stood in front of the giant presentation screen, explaining a new company strategy while throwing contemptuous glances at Richard. People like Richard are exactly why companies fall behind. The room went silent for a few seconds before a few younger employees let out awkward laughs. No one dared to disagree. In corporate America, silence is often how people protect their jobs. Richard remained seated, his hand resting on an old brown notebook. He didn't argue, didn't react. He simply nodded slightly, as if he had heard comments like that far too many times before. Ever since Brandon became manager, Richard was barely treated like an actual employee anymore. He was assigned the tasks nobody else wanted. Making coffee for conference meetings, wiping down whiteboards after brainstorming sessions, staying until 11 p.m. just to fix an Excel file Brandon had ruined but refused to take responsibility for. One time, Richard stayed awake all night, finishing a proposal for a major project. The next morning, when the document was submitted to upper management, his name had completely disappeared from the credits. The person who received all the recognition was Brandon. Even worse, Brandon intentionally turned Richard into a joke in front of the younger staff. One afternoon, while Richard struggled to fix a jammed printer, an intern quietly laughed and whispered to a coworker, "He looks more like office furniture than an employee." The group snickered. Richard heard every word, but he simply pulled out the paper tray and kept repairing the machine in silence. What nobody knew was that Richard lived every day under crushing pressure. The mortgage on his suburban Chicago home was already 2 months overdue. His daughter, Emily, had just received another tuition bill from Yale, and his wife was undergoing treatment for heart disease. The monthly cost of her medication alone was enough to keep any middle-aged man awake at night. That was why Richard couldn't quit. Not after the insults, not after the humiliation. Not even when walking into the office each day felt like entering a place where no one remembered how important he once was. After work, Richard often sat alone in the parking garage for several minutes. His old Ford struggled to start in the bitter early winter cold of Chicago. He would sit silently behind the wheel, staring at the city lights reflecting across the rain-covered windshield. Then his phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Dad, don't worry about me. I can get a part-time job." Richard read the message over and over before finally locking the screen. Inside the company, no one knew what the man sent out to buy coffee every morning had once been through. No one knew he had once led multi-million-dollar deals. No one realized that most of the knowledge Brandon used to sound intelligent was knowledge Richard had already mastered decades earlier. But Richard never said a word. Because sometimes adults don't stay silent out of weakness. They stay silent because they still have a family to protect. A slow voiceover echoed as Richard drove through Chicago's rain-soaked streets. No one notices the man who sacrifices everything until one day he disappears. And at that moment, the company still had no idea that the man they looked down on was the very person who could decide all of their futures. Over the following weeks, Brandon Cole stopped even trying to hide his contempt for Richard Walker. Humiliating Richard had become a form of entertainment around the office. On Monday morning, a group of interns sat around the glass conference table while Brandon walked them through the company's new marketing strategy. Richard entered quietly with a stack of reports in his hands and gently placed them on the table. Brandon picked up the report, flipped through a few pages, then suddenly hurled it back at Richard. The stack of papers slammed into Richard's chest before scattering across the floor. "You work like it's still 1998. Brandon's voice dripped with mockery. A few interns lowered their heads, snickering quietly. One young woman even pulled out her phone under the table to text her friend. Richard stood still for a moment. Then he bent down and picked up every sheet of paper as if nothing had happened. No reaction, no anger. And somehow, that only made Brandon enjoy it more. To Brandon, Richard represented everything he hated about the older generation. Slow, quiet, terrible at personal branding, completely out of touch with modern corporate culture. Every time he walked past Richard's desk, Brandon made sure to throw out another sarcastic comment. "Richard, you do know how to use Slack, right? Richard, we're in the AI era now. Nobody works old school anymore. Richard, I need you to stay late tonight and fix the presentation file. And please don't mess it up even more." Eventually, the entire office got used to seeing Richard as the last person to leave every night. 11 p.m., midnight. Some nights, close to 1 a.m., the light above Richard's desk was still glowing in an almost empty office floor. He sat alone in front of an aging computer monitor, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, quietly correcting every tiny mistake in projects Brandon would ultimately take credit for anyway. But Richard never complained. Because life outside the office was even harsher. The suburban Chicago home his family had lived in for 15 years still carried a mortgage he hadn't finished paying off. After the recession a few years earlier, Richard had drained nearly all of his savings just to keep the house. His daughter Emily had recently been accepted to Yale. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. But Yale's tuition bills kept Richard awake at night. He still remembered the look in Emily's eyes when she softly said, "Dad, if it's too hard, I can choose another school." Richard simply smiled. "No, sweetheart, you earned this." And then there was his wife. Every month, the cost of her heart medication was nearly half the mortgage payment. Richard understood one thing very clearly. If he lost this job, everything would fall apart. That was why he endured all of it. One rainy evening, Richard finally left work close to midnight. He walked slowly through the nearly empty parking garage, his old coat soaked through with rainwater. He opened the door of his worn-out Ford, slid into the driver's seat, and quietly shut the door behind him. He didn't start the engine, didn't turn on the radio. He simply sat there in silence, staring at the yellow city lights reflecting across the windshield. His eyes were red with exhaustion. Then his phone lit up. An email from the hospital appeared on the screen. Payment overdue. Richard stared at it for a long time. Then he locked the phone. In that moment, the 48-year-old man looked 10 years older. A slow voiceover echoed beneath the sound of rain. A middle-aged man rarely cries out loud. He suffers in silence, because too many people depend on him. The next morning, Richard was still the first person to arrive at the office. He made the coffee, straightened the conference room, checked the presentation system for the major meeting between the company and the investment firm, Blackstone Capital. Brandon walked in, holding a Starbucks cup, glanced at Richard, and smirked. "Don't screw things up today." Richard didn't answer. But at that exact moment, the phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. An unknown number. Richard stepped into the quiet hallway and answered the call. On the other end was a deep, respectful male voice. "Mr. Walker, the board meeting is confirmed." Richard fell silent for a few seconds. Then something in his expression changed. The exhaustion was gone. So was the quiet resignation people had grown used to seeing. All that remained was the calm, intimidating composure of a man who had spent years inside powerful boardrooms. "I'll be there." He hung up, then slowly adjusted the cuff of his old dress shirt. No one in the office noticed that moment. No one knew the meeting about to happen would change everything. No one realized that the man they treated like the office coffee runner was actually the person with the most influence over the $50 million deal on the table. And even fewer understood the truth. Richard Walker had never truly belonged in the small, humiliating role they had forced him into. The entire office was on edge as the day of the $50 million deal with Blackstone Capital finally approached. To the executive board, this deal was the company's chance to survive months of financial losses. But to Brandon Cole, this was the stage where he would rise to the top. All week long, Brandon practically lived at the office. He walked around with overwhelming confidence, constantly bragging about the upcoming deal, as if he alone had brought Blackstone to the company. "I told you." Brandon laughed loudly in the pantry in front of a group of younger employees. "After this deal, there's no way I'm not getting promoted to vice president." One of the interns asked admiringly, "Do you think the company's future is really going to change that much?" Brandon adjusted his tie and smirked. "After tomorrow, this company belongs to my generation." No one dared to challenge him. At that moment, Brandon looked like the perfect image of American success. Young, ambitious, confident, and always carrying himself like he had complete control over everything. Meanwhile, Richard Walker had become almost invisible inside the very company he had devoted nearly 20 years to building. On the morning of the critical meeting, Richard arrived early to prepare the executive conference room on the 42nd floor. He checked the projector, organized the documents, prepared coffee for the guests. Meanwhile, Brandon walked in wearing an expensive new suit, followed by several younger managers eager to flatter him. Brandon glanced at Richard setting coffee cups on the table and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Try not to embarrass us today, Richard." A few people forced awkward laughs. Richard simply nodded. Then he continued placing each coffee cup carefully onto the conference table with hands that were beginning to show their age. At the back of the room, a new employee whispered quietly to a coworker, "Why doesn't he just quit?" The coworker stayed silent for a moment before answering softly, "Because life after 40 isn't that simple." That sentence made both of them fall quiet. Because in America, everyone understands what that means. After 40, you're no longer working just for yourself. You work for the mortgage, for health insurance, for your children's college tuition, for hospital bills that can destroy an entire family in a matter of months. And sometimes, your pride is the very first thing you sacrifice just to keep everything from falling apart. Richard stood silently beside the massive glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The cold early winter winds swept between the skyscrapers below, while inside the luxurious conference room, he looked like a man no one even noticed anymore. No one knew what position the man carrying coffee had once held. No one knew he had signed deals far larger than this one. And even fewer realized that in just a few short hours, everything Brandon believed he owned would collapse right in front of the entire company. A slow voiceover echoed quietly, "The saddest part of adulthood is learning how to smile, even while your world is slowly falling apart." At exactly 9 a.m., the 42nd floor of the building felt like it was holding its breath. The entire executive board had gathered inside the conference room. Expensive suits, laptops already open to financial projections, fresh espresso still steaming on the table. It was the unmistakable atmosphere of corporate America preparing for a multi-million-dollar deal. Brandon Cole stood beside the presentation screen, radiating confidence. He had imagined this moment for months. The deal closes. His name appears in Forbes, a vice president title before the age of 30. Everything was only minutes away. Then, ding. The elevator doors opened. The entire room fell silent. The investment team from Blackstone Capital stepped inside with the kind of presence that instantly shifted the atmosphere. Leading them was Alexander Pierce, the young CEO of the billion-dollar investment firm known across Wall Street. Brandon immediately stepped forward, flashing a polished professional smile as he extended his hand. "Welcome, Mr. Pierce. It's an honor to finally meet you." But Alexander didn't shake his hand. Instead, his eyes swept across the room as though searching for someone. Then he asked simply, "Where's Richard Walker?" The room froze. The smile on Brandon's face stiffened instantly. Several managers exchanged confused glances. At the back of the room, Richard stood quietly holding a tray of coffee. Alexander saw him, and in that moment, the powerful CEO's expression completely changed. He walked quickly toward Richard as everyone watched in stunned disbelief. Then he lowered his head. A billionaire CEO bowed to the man serving coffee. "Everything I know about leadership, I learned from this man." The entire room went dead silent. Brandon stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. Alexander turned toward the board members and continued, "While all of you mocked him for serving coffee, he's the very reason Blackstone chose this company." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Several board members suddenly looked pale. One of them asked shakily, "Richard, who exactly are you?" Alexander answered for him. "Richard Walker was one of the original co-founders of our firm." The room was stunned. 20 years ago, he was one of the most brilliant strategists on Wall Street, the man who mentored an entire generation of us. Alexander looked at Richard with deep respect. He stepped away from the financial world after a family tragedy and never returned. Brandon staggered back a step. The color drained from his face. Every moment flashed through his mind, throwing reports at Richard, making him serve coffee, mocking him in front of younger employees. Sweat began running down the side of his face. One board member immediately stood up and demanded Brandon be suspended on the spot, pending an investigation into abuse of authority and workplace harassment. In just a few minutes, everything Brandon had built on arrogance collapsed completely. Alexander placed the contract on the table and spoke coldly. "Blackstone will only move forward with this deal if Richard Walker leads the project." No one dared object. Brandon looked at Richard, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Richard looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, not with triumph, just the calm eyes of a man who had lived through far too much in life. Then he answered quietly, "Because respect should be given freely, not only to people with power." The entire room fell silent, and for the first time in his life, Brandon Cole finally understood what it felt like to be looked down on from the bottom. That evening, Richard Walker drove his old Ford home beneath the glowing yellow lights of Chicago. But for the first time in many years, the heavy exhaustion that usually filled his face was gone. The moment the front door opened, Emily ran over and threw her arms around him. "Dad, I knew you could do it." His wife sat on the couch looking at him with quiet pride in her eyes. No words needed to be spoken. Richard understood it immediately. For the first time in months, his family could finally breathe again. A slow voiceover echoed softly. "The strongest men aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones who carry pain without letting it turn them cruel." At that same moment, back at the company, Brandon Cole quietly carried a cardboard box out of the elevator. No one rushed over to flatter him anymore. No more admiring looks. Only the cold silence of corporate America, where power shifts faster than almost anything else. Richard walked past Brandon in the main lobby. He didn't stop to mock him, didn't seek revenge, didn't say a single bitter word. He simply kept walking calmly forward. Because sometimes the greatest victory an adult can achieve is refusing to become the same kind of cruel person who once hurt them. Talent reveals ability, power reveals character, and adversity reveals a person's dignity. If this story touched you, leave a comment. Respect costs nothing. And subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, resilience, and real life.